young mother sat on the cold pavement, arms wrapped tightly around her sleeping twin daughters. Her clothes were worn, her body exhausted, yet her eyes remained strong. For years, Jasmine Carter had fought the relentless weight of life on the streets, doing whatever it took to protect her daughters, Maya and Zoe. Once, she had dreams. Now, survival was all that mattered. But on this fateful night, everything would change. A man in a sleek luxury car stopped at a red light, glancing out his window. His gaze landed on the woman and the children huddled beside her. Something about her felt oddly familiar. Then, the streetlight caught a glimmer of silver on her hand. The same ring he had given to someone he never thought he'd see again. What would you do if your past suddenly reappeared? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more powerful stories that prove life can change in an instant. The freezing night air wrapped around Jasmine like an uninvited guest, slipping through the holes in her tattered coat and biting at her skin. She sat against the rough brick wall of an alley, cradling her daughters under the only blanket they had. The thin fabric did little to shield them from the unforgiving winter chill, but it was all she could offer. The streets had been their home for far too long. Her body had adjusted to the hunger, the exhaustion, the endless struggle, but her heart never would. She looked down at her twins, their tiny faces peaceful despite the harsh world they had been born into. They deserved so much more than this. Zoe stirred first, her small fingers curling into Jasmine's sleeve as she blinked up with sleepy eyes. "Mommy, why is it always so cold?" Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that crushed Jasmine's heart. Jasmine forced a smile, brushing Zoe's curly hair from her face. "Because winter is here, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice warm despite the ache in her chest. "But you know what cold nights mean. We get to snuggle even closer. And that's the best part." Maya, still half asleep, tightened her grip around her mother's waist. "I don't like the cold," she murmured. "I want to go home." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. Home. A word that once held warmth, comfort, and a sense of belonging. Now it was just a distant dream. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We have each other, baby. That's what makes anywhere we go a home." Zoe looked up, her wide brown eyes filled with innocence. "Do you think we'll have a house again, like the ones with big windows and warm beds?" Jasmine hesitated for a moment before pressing a gentle kiss to Zoe's forehead. "Yes, my love, one day we will." She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but for them, she had to believe it. Jasmine tightened her grip around her daughters, shielding them as much as she could. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. The last bit of food she had managed to find, a half-eaten stale sandwich, had gone to Maya and Zoe. A kind stranger had left it beside her earlier, offering no words, just a fleeting moment of kindness, before disappearing into the crowd. The world moved on around them, indifferent and unaware of their struggle. Maya stirred in her lap, rubbing at her sleepy eyes with small hands. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Why do people walk past us like they don't see us?" Jasmine felt a sharp pain in her chest. How could she explain to a child that the world often chose to ignore what made it uncomfortable, that people preferred to pretend suffering didn't exist rather than acknowledge it? "They're busy," she said finally, forcing warmth into her tone. "Sometimes people don't stop because they're rushing to work or heading home to their families." "But we're people too," Zoe said, frowning. Jasmine smiled softly, running her fingers through her daughter's thick curls. "We are, my love. And the right people, the ones with kind hearts, will see us. They'll help us when we need it most." Maya leaned against her mother's shoulder, sighing. "I just wish Daddy was here." Jasmine's heart clenched, but she kept her expression calm. "I know, baby." "Do you think he ever thinks about us?" Zoe asked, her voice full of innocent hope. Jasmine hesitated before pressing a kiss to Zoe's forehead. "I don't know, sweetheart. she admitted. "But what I do know is that you have me, and I will never leave you." The twins didn't say anything after that. Maybe they understood the truth Jasmine could never bring herself to say out loud, that their father had left before they were born, vanishing without a second thought, without a word. To him, they had been nothing more than a mistake. Jasmine adjusted the blanket over her daughters as the wind picked up. Her fingers absent-mindedly toyed with the silver ring on her hand, the only reminder of a past that felt like another lifetime. It had once symbolized love, promises, and a future that never came to be. Now, it was just a cold piece of metal against her skin, a reminder of what she had lost. A sharp gust of wind blew through the alley, making Zoe shiver. Jasmine quickly wrapped her arms tighter around them. "Close your eyes, my loves. I'll keep you warm." Zoe buried her face in her mother's side, while Maya clung tightly to her. "Mommy? Yes, baby? Will things ever get better?" Jasmine closed her eyes and pressed a lingering kiss to Maya's forehead. "Yes, my love," she whispered. "They will." She had no idea how she would keep that promise, but she had to, for them. The city never truly slept. Even as the night stretched on, its streets pulsed with life. Hurried footsteps, distant sirens, and the occasional honk of an impatient driver. Yet for Jasmine Carter, it was a world she was no longer a part of. She sat hunched on the cold pavement, her back pressed against the rough brick of a building, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughters Maya and Zoe, who slept curled against each other beneath the thin, tattered blanket she had salvaged from a shelter weeks ago. Their soft, rhythmic breathing was the only thing reminding her that she had to keep going. Hunger gnawed at her insides, exhaustion weighed down her limbs. But she had no choice. Her girls depended on her. With trembling fingers she held out a small paper cup, its edges crinkled and weak, a silent plea for kindness. But people walked past as if she didn't exist, their eyes carefully avoiding her, as though acknowledging her would somehow taint them. She wasn't just homeless. She was invisible. Every now and then a passerby would glance her way, some with pity, others with disgust. A few muttered under their breath, their voices laced with judgment. "She probably did this to herself," a man whispered to his wife as they strolled past in their pristine winter coats. "People like her just don't try hard enough," she replied. Jasmine clenched her jaw, swallowing the anger and humiliation rising in her throat. If only they knew, if only they understood that she hadn't chosen this life, that one cruel twist of fate had sent her spiraling into a world of survival she never imagined she'd be in. She wanted to scream at them, to make them see her, but she had long since learned that society preferred its illusions. It was easier for them to believe she was nothing more than a product of her own failures than to accept that sometimes life simply didn't give people a chance. The night grew colder, and Jasmine shivered despite herself. Her coat, once thick and warm, had long lost its ability to shield her from the biting air. Her hands ached from the cold, her fingertips numb as she reached down to gently adjust the blanket over Maya's tiny shoulders. Her daughters deserved warmth. They deserved food, a bed, not this. The unforgiving pavement of the city refused to acknowledge them. Jasmine Carter wished she could take her daughters to a shelter, but space was always limited and she had been turned away too many times. Families weren't always a priority when beds were scarce. She had fought for spots before, standing in endless lines only to be told at the last moment that there was no room. Each time the disappointment in Maya and Zoe's eyes broke her a little more. She hated that they were growing up thinking this was normal, that they were learning to adapt to a life no child should ever know. The sharp clicking of heels against the pavement pulled Jasmine from her thoughts. A woman in a designer coat passed by, her blonde hair neatly styled, her posture stiff. Their eyes met for a brief second. Jasmine didn't dare speak, but she tilted the small paper cup in her hand slightly, a silent request. The woman's face hardened. Without a word, she clutched her expensive leather purse tighter against her side, as though afraid Jasmine might lunge forward and snatch it. The insult stung more than Jasmine wanted to admit. Did she really look that desperate, that dangerous? She wasn't a thief. She was a mother trying to keep her children alive. The woman quickened her pace, her disgust clear in every movement, as if Jasmine's mere existence offended her. Jasmine let out a slow, shaky breath, lowering the cup to her lap. It wasn't the first time someone had reacted that way, and it wouldn't be the last. She leaned her head back against the wall, exhaling deeply, trying to push the bitterness away. It wouldn't help her. It wouldn't feed her daughters. She needed to focus. The few coins rattling at the bottom of the cup wouldn't even buy them a full meal. Maybe if she found a diner with kind staff, they'd let her buy something small, a piece of bread, something to keep the hunger at bay for at least a little while. She looked down at Maya and Zoe, their faces peaceful despite the cold. She envied them, their ability to sleep through the worst of it, their unshaken trust in her, their innocence. They had no idea how much she was failing them. A lump formed in her throat. She couldn't cry, not here, not now. A man in a dark jacket walked past, then stopped a few feet ahead. Jasmine barely noticed at first, too lost in her own thoughts. But when he turned back and approached her, her body tensed. Instinctively, she pulled the girls closer. Not everyone who stopped had good intentions. But the man didn't seem threatening. His expression was unreadable as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, placing it carefully into her cup. Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. $5? That could mean a warm drink, a sandwich, something more than just scraps. She looked up at him, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd. She swallowed hard, gripping the bill tightly in her frozen fingers. She had learned not to expect kindness, and when it came, it always caught her off guard. Turning to her daughters, she gently brushed her fingers against Maya's cheek. "Wake up, sweetheart," she murmured. Maya stirred, blinking sleepily. "We're going to find some food," Jasmine added. Zoe yawned, rubbing at her eyes as she sat up. "Did someone help us, Mommy?" Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, baby, someone did." Zoe smiled, resting her head against her mother's arm. "See? I told you there are good people." Jasmine's chest tightened. Zoe still believed in goodness, in kindness. She still believed the world was fair. Jasmine wanted to protect that innocence for as long as she could. "Yes, love," she whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "You did." Carefully, she lifted the blanket from them, tucking it into her bag. She forced herself to stand, ignoring the ache in her legs from sitting on the cold pavement for so long. She took Maya's hand in one and Zoe's in the other, holding them tightly as they stepped away from their spot in the alley. The streets were still filled with people who would look right through them. But she held on to hope. Somewhere among them, someone would see them, someone would care. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow wouldn't be as cold. The traffic was unbearable, a sea of red brake lights stretching endlessly down the road, each vehicle inching forward at a painfully slow pace. Ethan Montgomery let out a long, frustrated breath, rubbing his temples. Another late night, another exhausting meeting that had drained what little patience he had left. He loosened his tie slightly, glancing at his driver, who sat motionless, gripping the wheel with the quiet resignation of a man used to long waits. The rhythmic honking, the muffled wail of distant sirens, and the occasional shouts of impatient drivers, all blended into the chaotic symphony of the city. Ethan sighed and shifted his gaze toward the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the blurred faces of pedestrians moving briskly, eager to escape the cold. And then his breath caught. At first, he thought she was just another person lost in the crowd, just another struggling mother trying to survive the harsh reality of the streets. But something about her stopped him cold. A woman sat huddled against the side of a building, her arms wrapped protectively around two sleeping children. Her coat was far too thin for the freezing air, her hair unkempt, strands falling over her face as she pressed her lips gently against one of the girl's foreheads. The way she held them, the way she tucked them closer to shield them from the biting wind, sent a sharp ache through his chest. But it wasn't just the heartbreaking sight that unsettled him. It was the faint sense of familiarity, the nagging feeling that he knew her. Ethan frowned, leaning forward slightly, trying to make out her features through the tinted window. Then, as if sensing something, she lifted her head for a brief moment. Her tired eyes scanned the street, searching perhaps for a sign, a miracle. And that's when he saw it. The silver ring on her finger. His pulse quickened, his mind racing to process what his eyes had just registered. He knew that ring. He had seen it before, had held it in his own hands. The streetlight's glow reflected off its simple yet unmistakable design, and suddenly memories came rushing back like an unstoppable flood. He hadn't seen that ring in years, not since the day he had slipped it onto the delicate finger of the only woman he had ever truly loved. Ian's heart pounded, disbelief clashing with recognition. It couldn't be. Could it? His hand hovered over the car door handle, his instincts screaming at him to go to her, to find out if his mind was playing tricks on him. But he hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a cruel coincidence? And yet, there was no mistaking the way she moved, the way she instinctively tucked her daughters closer, shielding them from the world as if they were the only thing that mattered. It was her. It had to be. His grip tightened around the handle, and before he could second-guess himself, he pushed the door open and stepped out. The sudden movement startled Jasmine. She had been too focused on the restless stirring of Maya in her arms, too caught up in the exhaustion pressing down on her, to notice the sleek black car idling just a few feet away. But when the door opened and a tall man stepped out, her body went rigid. Years of living on the streets had made her wary, cautious of sudden movements, of men approaching too quickly. Instinctively, she pulled her daughters closer, her heart hammering with the familiar rush of fear. She looked up, ready to move, ready to run if she had to. Then she saw him, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his breath visible in the cold air. His mind struggled to reconcile the woman before him with the girl he had once known. Her face was thinner now, her cheeks hollow, her eyes dulled by fatigue. But it was her. Jasmine. The realization struck him like a physical blow, momentarily leaving him breathless. How had this happened? How had she ended up like this? Jasmine's eyes flickered with confusion, recognition tugging at the edges of her exhaustion. There was something familiar about him, but the weight of survival had made it hard to place faces from a past she no longer belonged to. Then her gaze settled on his, and the years that had separated them seemed to close in an instant. A shiver, not from the cold but from something deeper, ran through her. No, it couldn't be him. Could it? Jasmine's tired mind struggled to process the moment. Her gaze fell on his sharp features, those piercing blue eyes she had once known so well. A cold shiver ran down her spine, her throat tightened. Jasmine? Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the space between them like a thunderclap. Jasmine stiffened, instinctively tightening her grip on her daughters. Her mind screamed at her to move, to turn away, to disappear into the shadows, but her body was frozen in place. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She didn't know what to say. She didn't even know how to breathe. Ethan took another cautious step forward, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. "It's you," he said, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite place, shock, maybe even pain. How is this possible?" Jasmine's pulse roared in her ears. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't in years. Her life had been built around survival, around keeping her daughters safe, but in this moment, standing before Ethan, she felt like that 17-year-old girl all over again. The girl who had once believed in love. The girl who had once believed in forever. the girl who had been abandoned. Maya stirred in her arms and Zoe whimpered softly, her tiny hands clutching at her mother's coat. The movement snapped Jasmine back to reality. It didn't matter who he was. It didn't matter that the sight of him made old wounds ache in a way she thought she had buried long ago. She was a mother, and her daughters came first. Always. Jasmine swallowed hard, forcing steel into her voice. I need to go. Ethan's expression shifted, confusion etched across his features. Wait, Jasmine, please. But she was already turning, already pulling Maya and Zoe closer, already retreating back into the shadows. Because no matter how much her heart recognized him, she wasn't that girl anymore. And whatever life he lived now wasn't meant for someone like her. Ethan Montgomery stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched her retreat. The moment he saw the silver ring glint under the dim streetlight, something inside him cracked open. Memories surged forward, relentless as a storm. It had belonged to his mother, a piece of her that he had held onto for years before giving it away to the one person he had believed would always be part of his life. His fingers clenched at his sides as reality settled in. This woman, the one holding two fragile children in her arms, her body hunched in a protective shield, was Jasmine. His Jasmine, or at least she had been once. But the girl he had loved was gone, replaced by a woman whose face was gaunt, whose eyes were hollow with exhaustion, whose clothes barely provided warmth against the biting night air. His breath hitched as the weight of what he was seeing pressed down on him. What had happened to her? How had she ended up like this? Jasmine, unaware of his inner turmoil, held her daughters closer, her fingers instinctively tightening around Zoe's small shoulders. The sudden attention from the man standing before her sent a ripple of unease through her. She had long since learned that prolonged eye contact with strangers rarely led to anything good. She kept her gaze low, avoiding confrontation, focusing instead on shielding her children from the icy wind. But then she noticed something strange. The way the man was looking at her, as if he knew her, as if he was trying to pull a memory from a distant past. Her pulse quickened, her body tense with apprehension. She didn't know him. At least, she didn't think she did. And yet there was something unsettlingly familiar about those piercing blue eyes, the way his features twisted with something she couldn't quite name. Recognition, or maybe something worse. A piece of the past she had spent years trying to forget. Jasmine swallowed hard, pushing the thought aside. It didn't matter. No one from her past had ever come back for her before. Why would that change now? Ethan took a step forward, barely aware that he was moving. He needed confirmation. He needed to hear her voice to know for certain that his mind wasn't playing cruel tricks on him. Jasmine, he said, his voice strained, almost hoarse, like saying her name made the air in his lungs collapse. The sound of it made her flinch slightly, but she didn't respond. He tried again, a little firmer this time. Jasmine Carter. And then he saw it. The slight widening of her eyes, the flicker of recognition buried beneath layers of exhaustion and time. But she didn't acknowledge it. Instead, she pulled her daughters even closer, her arms forming a protective barrier. She didn't recognize him. Or maybe she refused to. Jasmine's breaths came shallow and quick, her mind scrambling for answers. Why did he know her name? And why did the way he said it make something inside her ache in a way she hadn't felt in years? Her fingers brushed against the ring, the only piece of a life long gone. Now it was just another relic of a past she could never return to. She forced herself to meet his gaze, determined to keep her voice steady. "I don't know you," she said, her tone firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Please, just leave us alone." Ethan felt the words like a slap, but he knew better than to retreat. He couldn't. Not now. He took another cautious step forward, not wanting to scare her but unable to let her disappear back into the shadows of the city. "Jasmine, it's me," he pressed, searching her face for something, anything, that showed she still remembered. "It's Ethan." The name hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. He watched her closely, waiting for recognition to break through, for the past to come rushing back in the same way it had for him. But Jasmine's expression remained guarded, her lips pressing into a thin line as she shook her head. "I don't know you," she repeated. Her voice was quieter this time, less certain. But she did. She knew that name. It had once meant everything to her. It had been whispered in stolen moments, laughed in late-night conversations, cried in the silence of heartbreak. And yet, standing here now, looking at the man before her, the man she had once loved with every fiber of her being, she felt like he belonged to another life entirely. A life that had been ripped away from her the moment she had been cast out into the world with nothing but a broken heart and a child growing inside her. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in frustration. This wasn't how this moment was supposed to go. He had imagined seeing her again under entirely different circumstances, if he had even imagined it at all. But never like this. Never with her looking at him as if he were a stranger. His gaze flickered to the children in her arms, their tiny faces tucked against her chest. His stomach twisted. They were hers. That much was clear. But where was their father? What had happened to her after she left? He had questions, 1,000 of them. But none of them mattered more than the one that burned in his mind now. How had the woman he once loved ended up here, lost in the cold, with nowhere to turn? The weight of the moment settled heavily in his chest. "Jasmine, what happened to you?" Ethan's voice was softer now, almost pleading. Jasmine gave a bitter laugh devoid of humor. "Life happened," she said simply, shifting her daughters in her arms. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to take care of my children." She turned, ready to leave before the past could sink its claws into her and unravel the fragile world she had built. But Ethan wasn't willing to let her go. Not this time. Not without understanding how the girl he had once loved had become the woman standing before him now, shrouded in struggle and silence. He had lost her once before. He wasn't ready to lose her again. Ethan stood in the freezing night, his breath visible in the air as he watched Jasmine clutch her daughters, her body tensed like a cornered animal. The weight of everything unspoken between them filled the space, thick with hesitation and old wounds. He had just found her, but she looked at him as if he were an intruder in her fragile world. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that he hadn't forgotten, that he had never stopped thinking about her. But he knew better. Jasmine Carter wasn't the same girl he had once held under warm summer nights. Life had changed her, hardened her. And yet, despite the exhaustion etched into her features, despite the way she shielded her daughters from him, she was still the same Jasmine. The girl he had loved. The girl he had lost. "I want to help you," Ethan said, his voice steady, careful. He knew if he pushed too hard, she would run. He could see it in the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her daughters' coats, her body instinctively preparing to flee. "I know you don't trust me," he continued, his tone gentler now. "But please, let me help." Jasmine exhaled, her breath shaky as she glanced down at Maya and Zoe. Their small faces were turned toward her, their innocent eyes reflecting nothing but trust. She had spent years surviving, scraping by, doing everything she could to protect them. Accepting help, especially from him, felt like defeat, like admitting she wasn't enough on her own. But what choice did she have? The cold was merciless, and the emptiness in her daughter's eyes had grown harder to ignore. She looked back up at Ethan, her jaw tightening. "Why?" Her voice was sharp, edged with suspicion. "Why would you want to help me now?" Ethan flinched at the bitterness in her tone, but he didn't back down. "Because I should have found you sooner," he admitted, guilt thick in his voice. "Because whatever happened between us, it doesn't change the fact that you don't deserve this, and neither do they." He nodded toward the twins. You don't have to struggle like this anymore." Jasmine let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "You think it's that simple?" she asked, her grip tightening around her daughter's. "That I just step into your car and everything magically gets better?" She took a step back, instinctively recoiling from the idea. "That's not how the world works, Ethan," she continued, her voice raw. "You don't know what it's like out here. You don't—" Her voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to keep going. "You don't understand what it means to be abandoned, to fight for every scrap, to have no one." Her words hung between them, cold and sharp, leaving no room for denial. And for the first time in years, Ethan realized just how much he had truly lost. Jasmine cut herself off, pressing her lips together as she struggled to control the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Ethan's expression darkened. "You think I don't understand regret?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but firm. "You think I don't know what it's like to carry guilt for years, to wonder what could have been different?" He took a step closer, his gaze locked onto hers. "I don't know everything you've been through, Jasmine, but I know I've failed you, and I'm trying to make it right." Jasmine swallowed hard, looking away. A part of her wanted to believe him, to step into the warmth of his world, to let herself rest for the first time in years. But another part, the one that had learned to survive, the one that had built walls around her heart, screamed at her to turn away, to protect herself before it was too late. People didn't help without expecting something in return. That was a lesson life had taught her over and over again. A small tug at her sleeve made her freeze. She looked down to find Zoe staring up at her, tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her coat. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so cold." That was it. That was the moment Jasmine felt herself break. Whatever pride she had, whatever fear she held, none of it mattered in the face of her daughter's suffering. She had spent so long running, so long trying to protect them. But was she really protecting them? Or was she letting her own stubbornness keep them from a chance at something better? Her throat tightened as she looked back up at Ethan, her eyes filled with something he had never seen before, defeat, but also desperate hope. "If I do this," she whispered, her voice trembling, "it's not for me, it's for them." Ethan nodded, understanding. "I wouldn't expect anything else." For the first time in years, Jasmine allowed herself to be vulnerable, allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, things could change. With slow, hesitant steps, she reached for Maya's hand, then Zoe's, pulling them close as she turned toward Ethan's sleek black car. Every step felt heavy, as if she were walking toward something irreversible, because perhaps she was. When she reached the car, she hesitated. The polished surface reflected a distorted version of herself, a woman who had spent too long in the shadows, who no longer recognized the girl she had once been. Her fingers hovered over the door handle, doubt clawing at her one last time. Then she felt a tiny squeeze on her hand. Zoe, a silent reminder that this wasn't about pride. It was about survival. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine opened the door. The warmth from inside wrapped around her instantly, foreign and unfamiliar. She settled the girls in first, making sure they were safe, making sure this wasn't a dream. Then, finally, she climbed in. The seat beneath her was soft, comfortable in a way that made her want to cry. She didn't belong here. And yet, here she was. Ethan watched her carefully, sensing the war inside her. He didn't push, he didn't speak right away. He simply closed the door behind her and walked around to the driver's side. As the car pulled away from the curb, Jasmine stared out the window, watching the streets she had called home disappear behind her. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure where she was going. And for the first time in years, she dared to hope. The car ride to Ethan's mansion was silent, thick with unspoken fears and uncertainty. Jasmine sat stiffly in the back seat, her fingers unconsciously gripping the fabric of her worn-out coat. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run back to the familiarity of the streets before she stepped too far into a world she did not belong to. But then she glanced down at Maya and Zoe, curled against each other, their bodies finally warm after nights spent shivering. They looked peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, her daughters looked peaceful. That was the only reason she hadn't begged Ethan to turn the car around. That was the only reason she hadn't begged Ethan to turn the car around. It wasn't for her. It was for them. She had to keep reminding herself of that as the vehicle slowed. Turning her gaze to the window, her breath caught in her throat. The mansion before her was enormous, standing tall like something out of a dream. She had no right to be here. The pristine white stone, the massive arched entrance, the perfectly manicured hedges, it was the kind of home she had only ever seen in magazines. A stark contrast to the dirty alleys and crowded shelters she had known for the past 8 years. Everything about it screamed wealth, elegance, and exclusivity. She felt like an intruder just looking at it. Her fingers tightened around the seatbelt as the car rolled through the towering iron gates. Her heart pounded with an inexplicable dread. She didn't belong here, and she was certain that whoever was inside would make sure she knew it. As soon as the car stopped in the circular driveway, the massive front doors swung open and an older man stepped out. Even in the dim evening light, Jasmine could see the authority in his posture, the sharpness in his eyes. His presence alone commanded attention. Charles Montgomery, Ethan's father, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, a ruthless businessman known for his cold efficiency and an even colder heart. He had aged since she last saw him. His once dark hair was now completely silver, his features hardened by time. But his expression was exactly as she remembered, stern, unforgiving. And right now, all of that was aimed directly at her. Ethan barely had time to step out of the car before Charles spoke, his voice sharp as steel. "What the hell is this?" His gaze flickered to Jasmine, then to the sleeping children in the back seat. His frown deepened, his hands clenching at his sides. "Who are they, Ethan? And why are they in my driveway?" Ethan squared his shoulders, his jaw tightening. "They're my guests," he said firmly, stepping aside so Jasmine and the girls could get out. Jasmine hesitated for a fraction of a second before carefully unbuckling her daughters and lifting them into her arms. Maya stirred slightly but remained asleep, her small fingers grasping at Jasmine's coat. She held them close, as if bracing for impact. Charles's expression darkened as his gaze swept over them. "Guests?" he repeated, his tone laced with barely concealed disdain. "Ethan, are you out of your mind? You brought a homeless woman and 2 children into my home." Jasmine flinched at the words, shame burning through her. But she kept her head high. She had been called worse. Still, hearing it from Charles Montgomery, someone who had once been part of the life she had lost, stung in a way she hadn't expected. She forced herself to meet his gaze, even as she felt the weight of his judgment pressing down on her. Ethan took a step closer to his father, his expression unwavering. "Yes, I did," he said, his voice steady. "And they're staying." Charles let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This isn't some charity, Ethan. This is our home. We don't take in strays." Jasmine's fingers curled into fists at the word stray, as if she and her daughters were nothing more than abandoned animals seeking shelter where they didn't belong. Every part of her wanted to turn around, to walk away before he could say anything worse. But then she felt Zoe shift against her, letting out a soft sigh in her sleep, and she forced herself to stand her ground. She wasn't here for herself. She was here for them. Ethan's eyes blazed with frustration. "They have nowhere else to go," he said through clenched teeth, "and I won't let them sleep on the streets while I have the power to help." Charles scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "So what? You think bringing them here will fix everything? Do you have any idea what kind of attention this will bring? The media, the investors? What do you think they'll say when they find out that the heir to Montgomery Enterprises is housing some woman off the streets? Ethan didn't hesitate. I don't care what they say. Charles's nostrils flared, his patience clearly wearing thin. Of course you don't. You never think about consequences, Ethan. You never think about how your actions affect this family. His voice lowered, turning sharper. This woman does not belong in our world. Silence filled the space between them, heavy, suffocating. Jasmine clenched her jaw, refusing to let his words sink any deeper than they already had. She had heard those same sentiments before, from her own family, from people who had turned their backs on her the moment she had needed them the most. She had learned long ago that people like Charles Montgomery would never see her as anything more than an inconvenience. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he fought to keep his temper in check. Then, finally, he spoke. You're wrong. His voice was quieter now, but there was no mistaking the conviction in it. She belongs wherever I say she does. Charles's eyes flashed with a flicker of emotion. Anger, regret, or perhaps something else, but he said nothing. The tension between father and son stretched like a thin wire ready to snap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charles let out a sharp exhale and turned on his heel. Do whatever you want, he said coldly, but don't expect me to clean up your mess when this all falls apart. With that, he disappeared into the house, leaving only the echo of his disapproval behind. Jasmine stood motionless, her arms still wrapped around her daughter's, her heart pounding in her chest. She should have felt relieved that the confrontation was over. But instead, all she felt was exhaustion. This was only the beginning, and she knew it. No matter how much Ethan wanted to help, no matter how much he believed in her, the world he belonged to would never accept someone like her. Ethan turned to her then, his expression softer now. Come on, he said gently. Let's get you and the girls inside. Jasmine hesitated, glancing toward the grand entrance of the mansion. The warmth, the safety, it was right there. But so was the overwhelming feeling that she didn't belong. Still, when she looked at her daughter safe, asleep in her arms, she knew she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The guest room's warmth pressed in on her, suffocating rather than comforting. The soft mattress beneath Jasmine's tired body, the plush blanket draped over her shoulders, things that once would have been a dream, now felt foreign, like she was playing a role in someone else's life. Jasmine hesitated at the mansion's entrance. Warmth and safety lay ahead, yet doubt clung to her like a shadow. Maya and Zoe were curled up beside her, their small bodies breathing in perfect rhythm. Their faces were peaceful, relaxed for the first time in days. She should have felt relief. She should have felt safe. But the weight of the past sat heavy on her chest, refusing to let her rest. The confrontation with Charles, the tension in Ethan's voice as he stood up for her. It had cracked something open inside her, something she had spent years burying. She turned onto her side, staring at the ceiling as old memories stirred, slipping through the cracks she had tried so hard to seal. She had once believed in fairy tales, not the kind with castles and crowns, but the kind where love was enough, where two people could hold on to each other and build a future from nothing but a promise. She had been 17, reckless, full of hope when she had fallen for Ethan Montgomery. He had been her world, her safe place, the one person who had looked at her and seen more than just a girl trying to escape the expectations of a strict, unforgiving family. She had loved him with everything she had, clinging to him like he was the only light in the dark. And for a while he had loved her too. Or at least she had believed he did. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing back the sting of tears. Her parents had never approved of Ethan. The Montgomery name was powerful, wealthy, untouchable. And they had always reminded her that girls like her, ordinary, simple, didn't belong in a world like his. But she hadn't cared. She had spent stolen nights in his arms, whispering dreams about the future, marveling at the impossibility of their love. They had talked about leaving, about running away and starting fresh, somewhere far from the expectations weighing them both down. And then she had found out she was pregnant. She could still hear her mother's voice from the night she had told them the truth. The anger, the disgust, the way her father had stood there, arms crossed, unmoving, as her mother's words cut through her like a blade. "You've ruined yourself, Jasmine. Do you think he's going to stay? Do you think a Montgomery will ever claim a girl like you?" The shame had been unbearable, but she had refused to believe them. Ethan wasn't like that. He had promised her a future. He had promised her love. But when she had gone to him, terrified and vulnerable, clutching the pregnancy test in shaking hands, everything had changed. At first he had been silent, just staring at her, unmoving, his expression unreadable. She had waited, her heart hammering, needing him to say something, anything, to reassure her that they would figure it out together. But then he had run a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Jasmine, I don't know if I can do this." The words had struck harder than any slap, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had begged him to talk to her, to tell her that they could make it work, that he wouldn't turn his back on her. But he had only shaken his head, panic in his eyes. She had left that night feeling hollow, as if the world had cracked open beneath her feet. And when she had returned home, her parents had been waiting. There had been no sympathy, no comfort, only their final judgment. Her mother had packed a bag for her, left it by the front door, as her father's cold voice echoed in her ears. "If you walk out that door, don't come back." She had begged them to reconsider, pleaded for even the smallest kindness. But they had already made their choice. And so she had made hers. They had turned their backs on her. At 17, pregnant and utterly alone, Jasmine had no choice but to survive. The years that followed had been nothing but a relentless fight, nights in shelters, days spent hungry, moments curled up in subway stations when there was nowhere else to go. She had learned quickly that the world was unkind to girls like her, where kindness was rare and trust was dangerous. She had given birth to Maya and Zoe with nothing but a stranger's hand to hold. A nurse who had looked at her with pity as she brought her daughters into a world that had already cast them aside. And yet the moment she had held them, the moment their tiny hands curled around her fingers, she had made a promise. "I will never abandon you. I will never be like them." Now, years later, she sat in a house so far removed from the world she had come to know, staring at the man who had once been everything to her. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. She didn't know how long he had been there watching her, but she didn't care. She was too tired to pretend, too worn down to hide the truth in her eyes. Turning to face him fully, her voice was quiet but steady. "You were the only good thing in my youth." Ethan flinched as if the words had struck him like a physical blow. He took a slow step forward, his jaw tightening. "Jasmine, He stopped, hesitating. And she saw it then, the regret in his eyes, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. But it was too late for apologies. Too late for him to rewrite the past. She let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "Don't." Her voice was exhausted, worn. "Don't say you're sorry. It won't change anything." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I should have been there," he admitted. "I should have fought for you." Jasmine let out a bitter laugh. "You had your chance," she said, her voice raw, "but you walked away." Silence stretched between them, heavy with things left unsaid. She could see that he wanted to fix it. It was in the way he looked at her, the way his hands clenched at his sides as if he was trying to hold something back. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She had been broken and rebuilt too many times to believe in fairy tales. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet. "I want to help you now." Jasmine met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "Then don't make me regret letting you." With that, she turned back toward her daughters, running a gentle hand over Zoe's sleeping face. The past couldn't be undone, but perhaps the future still held possibilities. The days that followed Jasmine's arrival in Ethan's home were filled with tension, adjustment, and silent battles neither of them dared acknowledge. Ethan had expected her to soften under the warmth of stability, to welcome the comfort of a roof over her head, of food that didn't come from discarded scraps. But she was still guarded, still keeping a safe distance, as if afraid that at any moment the life he offered her would be ripped away. He saw it in the way she moved through the mansion, never quite settling in, never allowing herself to get too comfortable. She would sit at the edge of the couch instead of sinking into its cushions. She would hesitate before accepting a warm meal, as if expecting there to be conditions attached. And at night he knew she barely slept, always half awake, always prepared to leave if necessary. It frustrated him how deeply she had been conditioned to believe that kindness was temporary, that people only offered help when they wanted something in return. But beyond that frustration there was something else, something deeper, a quiet admiration that grew stronger with every moment he spent watching her. It wasn't her beauty that captivated him, though she was still breathtaking in a way that made his chest tighten. It was her resilience, the way she carried herself despite everything she had endured, the way she spoke softly to her daughters, even when exhaustion weighed heavy on her. Even when the world pressed down on her shoulders, she still held her head high, refusing to be broken by life's cruelty. Ethan had met countless women, polished, poised, the kind who moved effortlessly through his world and played by its rules. But none of them had ever held his attention the way Jasmine did. None of them had ever made him feel like this. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Ethan found her sitting outside on the balcony. A steaming cup of tea rested in her hands. The mansion's vast garden stretched out before her, a world of greenery and stillness, a kind of peace she wasn't used to. She didn't hear him approach at first, too lost in thought, her fingers absently tracing the rim of the cup. "You look like you're trying to escape," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't startle. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she let out a quiet sigh before finally glancing at him. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, her voice hesitant. "Being still, having space." She gestured vaguely toward the open air, the vastness of the estate around them. "It feels unnatural." Ethan moved closer, pulling out the chair beside her. "You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder, Jasmine," he said, watching her carefully. "No one is going to take this away from you." She let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "That's the thing, Ethan. Nothing is ever permanent. Not safety, not kindness. I learned that the hard way." Finally she met his gaze, and the raw honesty in her eyes made his breath catch. "People don't help without expecting something in return." The words stung more than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, to tell her that he was different. But was he? He had left her before. He had let her suffer alone. He had been just like the people she had learned not to trust. "I don't expect anything from you," he said instead, his voice softer now. "I just want you to know that you don't have to fight so hard anymore." Jasmine studied him for a long moment, searching for the lie, the hidden motive. But there was nothing in his expression except quiet sincerity, and that scared her more than anything. "I don't know how to be anything else," she admitted. "Fighting is all I've ever done." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Ethan watched as she took a slow sip of her tea, her fingers tightening around the cup as if grounding herself. And then, before he could stop himself, he reached across the table and took her free hand in his. Her body tensed immediately, her first instinct to pull away. But she let him hold her hand, let his warmth seep into her skin, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to run. Ethan traced his thumb over her knuckles, memorizing the feel of her, the slight roughness of her fingertips, the evidence of everything she had survived. Ethan had never stopped loving her, he knew that now. Whatever had been between them all those years ago, whatever had been torn apart by time and circumstance, it had never really left. He had convinced himself that she was just a memory, a painful regret. But sitting here, touching her, feeling her presence so close, it was clear she had never been just a memory. She had always been a part of him, buried beneath years of mistakes. Jasmine swallowed hard, finally breaking the silence. "This doesn't change anything, Ethan," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," he murmured, "but it's a start." And for the first time she didn't pull away. The morning was unusually quiet in the Montgomery estate, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the air itself held its breath. Ethan sat at the dining table, sipping his coffee, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Jasmine was beginning to settle in, slowly, cautiously, as if she expected everything to crumble beneath her at any moment. He had seen it in her eyes the night before, the silent battle between trust and fear, the way she hesitated before letting herself relax, if only for a moment. He didn't blame her. Years of surviving on the streets had taught her that nothing good lasted forever. And yet, despite everything, he was determined to prove to her that this time was different. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. James, the family's longtime butler, stepped into the room. His usually composed expression was slightly off. There was something in his posture, the way he clutched a single envelope in his hand, that made Ethan immediately sit up. James placed the letter on the table with measured precision. "This arrived early this morning, sir, no return address." His voice was even, but Ethan could sense the unease beneath it. Setting his coffee aside, Ethan picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. The paper was thick, expensive, not the kind sent by just anyone. A bad feeling settled in his gut as he carefully tore it open and pulled out the letter. The moment his eyes scanned the words, his grip on the paper tightened. "Stay away from her. Stay away from her children. You don't know who you're dealing with." No signature. No indication of who had sent it. Just those chilling words, typed neatly and precisely, as if whoever had written them wanted to leave no room for misinterpretation. A slow, simmering anger rose in Ethan's chest as he reread the message. Someone was watching them. Someone knew that Jasmine was here. And worse, they wanted her gone. Ethan exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening, as he folded the letter with controlled precision and placed it back on the table. James cleared his throat. "Sir, do you believe this is a real threat?" Ethan's grip on the letter tightened. His answer was immediate. "Yeah." His voice was calm, but his mind was racing. Who would do this? Who had been watching Jasmine? He thought back to everything she had told him about her life on the streets, the people she had encountered, the father of her children who had abandoned her without a second thought. Could it be him? Could Ryan Parker have resurfaced after all these years? The thought sent a fresh wave of fury through him. If Ryan thought he could waltz back into Jasmine's life and tear her away from safety, he was gravely mistaken. James studied Ethan for a moment before speaking again. "Should I alert Mr. Charles about this?" Ethan hesitated. This would only fuel Charles's argument that Jasmine didn't belong here. This wasn't about differences anymore. This was a threat Ethan couldn't ignore. This wasn't about class anymore. This was a threat Ethan couldn't ignore. "Not yet," Ethan finally said, his voice firm but controlled. "I want to handle this first." He rose from his seat, letter in hand, and strode toward the hallway. He needed to see Emily. She needed to know what they were dealing with. As he approached the guest wing of the house, he slowed, taking a steadying breath, before knocking lightly on the door. It opened almost immediately. Emily stood there, her expression wary, her body tense. "What is it?" she asked, immediately sensing the tension in his demeanor. Ethan held out the letter. "Someone sent this." Emily frowned, taking the paper from him. Her eyes moved over the words, her face paling as she read. Her fingers trembled slightly, her grip tightening. "No," she whispered, barely audible. Ethan's stomach twisted at her reaction. "Emily," he said carefully, "do you know who sent this?" She shook her head, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. "I don't know," she said, her voice thin, uncertain. "It could be anyone. I've had to look over my shoulder for years, Ethan. People don't just let you disappear." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "There are debts, favors, and there's Ryan." The name made Ethan's jaw tighten. "Never wanted them," she continued, her voice strained. "But that doesn't mean he wants them safe." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. The idea that the father of her children might be involved in this made his blood boil. "If it's him, I'll handle it," he said firmly. "No one is going to touch you or the girls." Emily let out a shaky breath, running a hand through her hair. "You don't understand. People like Ryan, men like him, don't just go away. If he's back, it's because he thinks he has power over me. And if someone else sent this, that means they already know where I am. That's never good." Ethan stepped closer, his voice like steel. "Then we find them, and we make sure they never come near you again." For the first time, Ethan saw true fear in Emily's eyes. Not just for herself, but for Lily and Sophie. After years of survival, she had finally let her guard down, and now someone was watching. Ethan grasped her trembling hand, his grip firm. "You're not alone anymore," he vowed. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Emily exhaled shakily, gripping the letter in her other hand. But promises didn't stop threats. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Ethan sat in his office, fingers drumming against his mahogany desk, his mind racing. Whoever sent that letter knew where Emily was. That meant they were watching. Waiting. For the past 2 hours he had been making calls, trying to connect the dots, trying to find out who would want to hurt Emily and her daughters. And then he found the answer he had been dreading. Ryan Parker was back in town. The moment the name flashed across his screen, Ethan's grip tightened on the mouse. A name he hadn't heard in years. A name that carried destruction wherever it went. Ryan Parker. The man who had abandoned Emily when she needed him most. The man who had left her alone, pregnant and helpless, only to vanish like a ghost. Ethan had never met him, but he had seen the damage he had done. And now he was back. Ethan leaned back in his chair, inhaling sharply. This wasn't a coincidence. Ryan's sudden reappearance. The threatening letter. It was all connected. He needed to tell Emily. But how? How did he tell her that the man who had shattered her world once before was lurking just beyond the walls of her newfound safety? He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. She deserved to know, even if it terrified her. When he finally knocked on the door to Emily's room, it was late. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the wind outside. The door opened quickly. Emily stood there, her expression still etched with exhaustion, but now with something else. Anxiety. Ethan didn't waste time. "It's Ryan," he said, his voice low. "He's back." The color drained from Emily's face. Her grip on the door tightened, knuckles turning white. For a moment she said nothing, only stared at him, her breathing shallow. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked the question he had been dreading. "What does he want?" Emily's expression was guarded, as if she already sensed that something was wrong. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. She had been on edge since the letter arrived, and he couldn't blame her. "Can I come in?" His tone was softer than usual, careful. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting a warm light over the sleeping forms of Lily and Sophie. Emily glanced at them before crossing her arms, her posture tense and defensive. "What is it?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Ryan is back." The color drained from Emily's face. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she shook her head as if rejecting the words entirely. "No," she whispered. "He can't be." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I had someone look into it. He came back 3 days ago. He's been asking about you." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the back of a chair, gripping it for support. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the past crashing down on her all at once. The last time she had seen Ryan Parker, he had walked away without a second glance, without caring that she was carrying his children, without caring that she had nowhere to go. He had vanished, as if she had never mattered, as if the twins had never mattered. And now, after all these years, he was back. Ethan watched her carefully. "Emily," he said gently, "you need to tell me what he's capable of." She let out a sharp breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't understand. Ryan isn't just some ex-boyfriend. He's dangerous, Ethan. He doesn't do things without a reason. If he's back, it's because he wants something." She swallowed hard. "And that means we're in trouble." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had expected her to be upset, but this was pure fear. He had never seen Emily like this before. She was strong, always standing her ground, always fighting back. But now she looked trapped. "What did he do to you?" Ethan asked, his voice low, steady. Emily shook her head, stepping away as if trying to put distance between herself and the memories. "It's not what he did to me," she murmured, her hands balling into fists. "It's what he's capable of." She turned to look at Ethan, her eyes filled with something he had never seen before. "Ryan doesn't just walk away from things, he destroys them." Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind racing. If Ryan had come back for Emily, if he had come back for the twins, then this was only the beginning. He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "We won't let him get near you," he promised. "Not you, not the girls." Emily bit her lip, her breathing still uneven. "You don't know him, Ethan," she whispered. "You don't know what he's capable of." Ethan met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then tell me," he said, "because whatever he's planning, we're going to stop it." Emily looked at him for a long moment, her mind a battlefield of memories, pain, and fear. And then finally she whispered, "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Outside, the night was cold, the kind of sharp chill that settled deep into the bones. Emily barely felt the cold wind biting at her skin. She stood motionless outside a small cafe on the far side of town, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sound of passing cars. She hadn't wanted to come, hadn't wanted to see him again. But she knew she had no choice. Ryan Parker had forced his way back into her life. If she didn't stop him now, he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, her daughters. The thought alone made her grip the edges of her coat tighter, as if trying to shield herself from the storm that was about to hit. The door to the cafe swung open, and there he was. Ryan. He hadn't changed much. The same dark, calculating eyes, the same smirk that once made her heart race but now only filled her with dread. His presence felt suffocating, as if the air itself recoiled at his arrival. He strolled toward her with the confidence of a man who had never suffered consequences, a man who thought he still had power over her. But he didn't. Not anymore. "Well, well," he drawled, shoving his hands into the pockets of his expensive jacket. "Look at you, Emily. Fancy seeing you again." His gaze swept over her, assessing, mocking. Then his smirk deepened. "I hear you've been staying in a mansion. guess you finally figured out how to trade up." Emily clenched her jaw, refusing to let his words get to her. She had expected this. Ryan had always known exactly how to push people, how to twist the truth until it suited his narrative. But she wasn't that naive, desperate girl anymore. She lifted her chin, keeping her voice steady. "Why are you here, Ryan?" He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Straight to the point. I always liked that about you." Then his expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he took a slow step forward. "But I don't like being ignored. You've been real hard to find, Emily. Disappeared like a ghost. And then, bam! Suddenly you're living with Ethan Montgomery." He practically spat Ethan's name, his jaw tightening. "You want to tell me how that happened?" Emily crossed her arms, her nails digging into her sleeves. "What happens in my life is none of your business," she said firmly. "You lost the right to care the moment you walked away." Ryan's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Because you have something that does concern me. Two things, actually." Emily's stomach twisted. She knew where this was going, but she refused to let fear take control. She had spent too many years being afraid of him. "Not anymore." "You mean the daughters you never wanted?" she shot back, her voice sharp as glass. "The ones you abandoned without a second thought?" Ryan's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. "Things change," he said smoothly. "And now I think it's time I take some responsibility." A bitter laugh escaped Emily's lips before she could stop it. "Responsibility? You don't even know what that word means." She took a step closer, her eyes burning with fury. "You weren't man enough to be a father, and now you want to control them?" Her voice was shaking now, but not with fear. With anger. Years of pain, of struggling, of raising Lily and Sophie alone, all of it boiled to the surface. "You left us, Ryan. You made your choice, and you don't get to walk back into their lives like nothing happened." Ryan's nostrils flared, his fingers twitching at his sides. "You think you can decide that?" His voice dropped, turning sharp. "You think Ethan Montgomery is going to protect you forever?" Emily's breath hitched, but she refused to back down. "I don't need him to protect me. I've protected myself for years. I protected them for years." She took another step forward, meeting his glare with unwavering strength. "But I won't let you hurt them." Ryan exhaled sharply through his nose, running a hand through his hair as he let out a dry chuckle. "You really think you can stop me?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You forget who I am, Emily. I don't lose." A voice cut through the tension. "No, but you're about to." Ryan barely had time to turn before Ethan stepped between them, rigid, his eyes blazing with protectiveness Emily had never seen before. "I suggest you leave," Ethan said, his voice low and controlled. Ryan studied him for a moment, his smirk returning, but this time it was forced. "Look at this," he mused. "The rich boy playing the hero." Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the fury he kept contained. "I don't play games, Ryan," he said, "and I don't make threats, so listen carefully." He took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower. "You are not welcome here. You don't get to walk back into Emily's life and pretend you care, and if you ever come near her or the girls again—" He let the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken consequence. Ryan's smirk faltered. For the first time, something flashed in his eyes, hesitation. Ethan didn't wait for a response. "Leave, now." Ryan exhaled sharply, clenching his jaw. He glanced once more at Emily, then back at Ethan, weighing his options. And then, with a cold, humorless chuckle, he turned and walked away. Emily exhaled sharply, her pulse still pounding. Ethan turned to her, concern etched across his face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, but her fingers still trembled. For now. They both knew this wasn't over. "The billionaire playing the hero?" Ryan sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Ethan, what do you get out of this? What's she giving you?" Ethan didn't flinch. His expression remained unreadable as he met Ryan's glare head-on. "The only thing that matters, the chance to fix what you broke." For a brief second, Ryan's mask cracked. His jaw tensed, his hands curling into fists, but he knew he was outmatched. Letting out a long breath, he stepped back, his smirk returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "This isn't over," he warned, his voice laced with quiet menace. Then, with one last look at Emily, he turned and disappeared into the night. The moment he was gone, Emily felt her knees weaken. The tension that had held her together for so long suddenly crumbled, leaving her unsteady. Before she could fall, Ethan caught her, his hands gripping her shoulders gently. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, but her hands were still shaking. "He's not going to stop," she whispered. Ethan's hold tightened. "Neither am I." And for the first time in years, Emily believed him. The air inside the Montgomery estate was thick with tension, an invisible weight pressing against the grand walls of the mansion. Ethan had always known his father to be a ruthless man, practical, calculating, and unwilling to let emotions cloud his judgment. Charles Montgomery had built his empire on discipline and control, on knowing when to cut ties with the weak and align himself with the powerful. And now, standing in his father's study, Ethan knew he was being forced to make a choice. From the moment Ethan brought Emily and the girls into his home, the tension had been building like a storm on the horizon. After the confrontation with Ryan, the clouds had finally burst. Charles paced the room, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. His face was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally he turned, his sharp gaze locking onto Ethan with unwavering precision. "I warned you, Ethan," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I told you this would happen. I told you she would bring trouble." He gestured toward the newspaper on his desk, its front page smeared with scandal. The headline blared Ethan Montgomery's name, alongside speculation about his involvement with a homeless woman and her children, and the sudden reappearance of Ryan Parker. "This is a disaster," Charles continued, "and it's only going to get worse." Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Emily and the girls have nothing to do with this," he said firmly. "Ryan is the problem, not them." Charles scoffed, his mouth curling in disdain. "Don't be naive," he said, shaking his head. "This entire situation is a mess, Ethan, a liability. You think the board won't react to this? You think the investors won't start questioning your judgment? You have a responsibility to this company, to this family." His voice turned sharp, cutting like a blade. "And that responsibility does not include her." Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself. For years he had fought to prove himself to his father, to earn his respect, to show he was worthy of carrying the Montgomery legacy. But this wasn't about business. This was about right and wrong. He met his father's gaze, refusing to back down. "She needs help," he said simply, "and I won't abandon her." Charles let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Help?" he repeated, shaking his head. "Is that what you're calling it?" He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "Wake up, Ethan. She's using you. You think she hasn't done this before? Found some rich man to take pity on her, to take her in?" Ethan's blood boiled. He had expected resistance, but not this, not the sheer cruelty in his father's words. The way Charles spoke about Emily, as if she were nothing more than a parasite clinging to the edges of their world, ignited a fire in Ethan's chest. "You don't know her," he said, his voice cold and steady. "You don't know what she's been through, what she's fought to survive. She's stronger than anyone I've ever met, including you." Charles's expression darkened. "This isn't about strength. he snapped. "It's about survival, about knowing when to cut your losses." Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice unwavering. "And that's exactly what I'm doing." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, unrelenting tension. Charles studied his son for a long moment, his eyes narrowing, calculating. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned away. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "And when it all falls apart, don't expect me to clean up your mess." Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't need you to—" And with that he turned and walked away, leaving his father standing in the cold, empty study. His hands curled into fists. "And you are making the wrong one." Ethan felt his heart pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life chasing his father's approval, molding himself into the perfect son, the perfect businessman. But for the first time, he realized that nothing he did would ever be enough. His father would always see the world in black and white, power and weakness, assets and liabilities. And in Charles Montgomery's eyes, Emily was not an asset. Charles exhaled sharply, stepping back. His voice was calm, final. "If you choose this woman, you are no longer my son." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He stared at his father, searching for something. Regret? Hesitation? A sign that this was just a threat and not a real ultimatum? But Charles's face remained cold, unreadable, as immovable as ever. He meant it. This was a choice, Emily or the Montgomery name. Silence filled the room, thick with unspoken words. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. And then, finally, he spoke. "Then I guess I was never your son to begin with." For the briefest second, something flickered in Charles's eyes, something almost human. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same cold detachment he had perfected over the years. "So be it," he said simply. Then he turned, walking toward his desk, dismissing Ethan without another word. Ethan didn't wait. He turned on his heel and walked out. The moment he stepped into the hallway, he let out a slow breath, steadying himself. This was it. He had made his choice. And for the first time in his life, he felt free. And he didn't regret it. Emily was waiting for him outside the study, her arms wrapped around herself as if bracing for bad news. When she saw his face, she frowned. "What happened?" she asked softly. Ethan met her gaze, his chest tightening. Everything had changed in that room. But when he looked at her, the woman who had suffered more than anyone should have to, the mother who had fought to protect her daughters, the only person who had ever made him question everything he thought he knew he had made the right decision. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I chose you." Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. And even though the battle was far from over, for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. That morning, the Montgomery estate felt emptier. It wasn't the weather, though the sky was overcast, threatening rain, but the hollow silence left in the wake of Ethan's decision. He hadn't slept. Not really. His father's words still echoed in his mind, sharp as a blade. "If you choose this woman, you are no longer my son." But that was no longer his greatest concern. There was something else now, something far worse. James, the butler who had practically raised Ethan after his mother's passing, entered the study with a hesitant step. His normally impassive face was drawn with concern as he held out a small envelope. The moment Ethan saw it, a wave of nausea rolled through him. The same expensive, unmarked paper. The same ominous feeling tightening in his gut. Another letter. Ethan took it with steady hands, though inside he was anything but calm. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the words written in precise, deliberate strokes. "You think you've won, but you don't even know what game you're playing. You think you're protecting her, but how will she feel when she finds out the truth? You don't need to fear me, Ethan. You need to fear what happens when your secrets come to light. I don't need violence to destroy you. I just need the truth." Ethan hailed sharply, his grip tightening until the paper crumpled in his fist. Damn it, this wasn't over. He had known this fight wouldn't be easy, but now it wasn't just about Emily. Now it was about the past, and someone out there was ready to bring it crashing down. Ethan had expected Ryan to try something, but this was worse than threats of violence. Ryan wasn't just after Emily. He wanted to dismantle everything Ethan had left. And worst of all, Ethan knew Emily would ask questions. What truth? What was Ryan talking about? And for the first time since all of this had started, Ethan didn't know if he was ready to give her the answers. Emily sat in the living room, her mind already restless when she heard sharp footsteps echoing in the hallway. She knew it was Ethan before she even looked up. The way his movements were too controlled, his jaw clenched too tight, he was holding something back. And she had learned to recognize when Ethan Montgomery was trying to keep his world from falling apart. "Another letter?" she asked before he even had the chance to speak. Ethan hesitated, but there was no point in denying it. He exhaled and handed her the crumpled paper. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers tracing over the words as she read. Her brows furrowed, her grip tightening. When she finally looked up, there was confusion in her gaze, but also something else. Something that made Ethan's stomach twist. "Now, what does this mean?" she asked, her voice steady, but he could hear the unspoken fear beneath it. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing for a moment before finally stopping in front of her. "It's just Ryan trying to manipulate you," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt empty. Because even he knew that Ryan wasn't bluffing. Emily narrowed her eyes. "That's not an answer." Ethan sighed heavily. He had spent years keeping this secret buried, believing it was the right thing to do. But now, standing in front of the woman he had fought so hard to protect, the weight of it was unbearable. "There are things about my family that I never told you," he admitted. "Things that, if Ryan gets his hands on, he could twist into something dangerous." Emily stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, quietly, she asked, "Does this have anything to do with why you left me back then?" The question cut deeper than he expected. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had always justified his past mistakes as being a consequence of circumstance. But Emily's voice held something deeper than anger. It held betrayal. And that was something he could no longer ignore. He crouched down in front of her, his hands reaching for hers. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. "Emily," he said, his voice softer now, "I never wanted to leave you, but my father, he made sure I believed I didn't have a choice." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak, letting him continue. "When I found out you were pregnant, I wanted to be there for you. I was ready to run away, to fight for us. But then my father called me into his office and told me that if I left with you, he would destroy everything." Ethan swallowed hard, the memory still bitter after all these years. "He threatened my mother's inheritance, my business prospects, everything I had worked for. And he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I was weak. I let him convince me that walking away was the only way to protect you." Emily's breath was unsteady. "You think abandoning me protected me?" Ethan shut his eyes for a brief moment. "No," he admitted. "I know it didn't, and I've regretted it every day since." He squeezed her hands, forcing her to look at him. "But now I have a choice, and I choose you." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I choose to fight for you, for the girls, and I won't let Ryan or my father take this away from us again." Emily searched his face, her defenses still high, uncertain if she could believe him. But something in his voice, in the way his grip never wavered, made her pulse quicken. Maybe, just maybe, he really meant it this time. Then, softly, he whispered, "I won't let him hurt you again." Emily's throat tightened, a lump forming as years of solitude pressed against her ribs. For so long she had trained herself not to hope, not to believe anyone would stay. But right now, in this moment, Ethan was here. He wasn't running. He wasn't backing down. For the first time in years, she dared to believe she wasn't alone. She had carried the weight of his absence, the pain of being left alone to fend for herself. And now, for the first time, she saw regret. Real, raw regret. But regret wasn't enough. Taking a shaky breath, she pulled her hands away. "Then prove it," she whispered, "because if Ryan is coming for us, I need to know that you won't run this time." Ethan's jaw tightened, his resolve unshakable. "I won't." The stakes had never been higher. And this time, he wasn't running. The night was heavy with tension, the kind that made the air feel thicker, cold. Emily sat alone in the dimly lit guest room of the Montgomery estate, her fingers absently tracing the worn silver ring on her hand. Outside, beyond the estate's massive gates, the faint hum of the city echoed, a constant reminder that the world still existed. A world filled with threats, uncertainties, and a past that refused to let her go. Lily and Sophie were asleep in the adjacent room, their soft breathing the only sound grounding her in this moment. But even with them safe behind closed doors, Emily couldn't shake the unease pressing against her chest. Something felt off. She had spent years honing her instincts, learning to recognize the telltale signs of danger before it struck. Tonight, every fiber of her being screamed that something was wrong. The Montgomery estate was supposed to be impenetrable, security cameras, guards at every entrance. Yet, as the night stretched on, the creeping sensation of being watched refused to leave her. Slowly, she moved toward the window, carefully pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The garden below was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows against the stone pathways. And then, movement. A dark figure slipped through the trees, moving fast, purposeful. Her blood turned to ice. Ryan. She barely had time to react before the door burst open with a force that sent her stumbling backward. And there he was, taller, stronger. His presence made the room shrink, his dark eyes burning with fury as he stepped inside, shutting the door with slow, deliberate intent. "You thought you could hide from me." Ryan's voice was low, venomous. "Did you really think running to him would keep you safe?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show fear. She squared her shoulders, taking a step back, only to realize there was nowhere left to go. "You don't belong here, Ryan," she said, her voice steadied despite the tremor in her hands. "Get out." Ryan chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "That's cute, Em," he mocked. "You really think you get to tell me what to do now? You think just because you've got a rich boyfriend that means I don't have a say in my own kids' lives?" Emily's fists clenched. "They were never yours," she shot back, fire burning in her words. "You made that choice when you let me suffer alone. You don't get to come back now and pretend to care." The words struck something in him. His jaw tightened, and in a blink he lunged. Emily gasped as his fingers wrapped around her wrist in a bruising grip, his strength overwhelming. She struggled, twisting against his hold, but he only pulled her closer, his breath hot against her face. "You don't get to decide that." His voice was low, dangerous. "You think I'll let you just walk away?" Emily's pulse roared in her ears. She had spent years fighting to survive. And she sure as hell wasn't going to let Ryan Parker tear it all down. "You think I'll let you live this perfect little life with him?" Ryan's grip tightened painfully around Emily's wrist. "I don't think so." A flash of fear surged through her, but she refused to let it consume her. She had fought too hard, survived too much, to cower before him now. Before she could respond, the door flew open. Ryan turned. Too late, Ethan tackled him, slamming him into the dresser. His grip on Emily broke as he hit the floor. Ethan's usual composure was gone, replaced by pure, burning rage. He yanked Ryan up by his collar, voice low and deadly. "You dare touch her?" Ethan's voice was raw, his fists clenched as Ryan struggled. "You think you can walk into my house and lay a hand on her?" Ryan let out a breathless, mocking chuckle, wiping blood from his split lip. "What's the matter, Montgomery?" he sneered. "Scared she'll realize you're just as bad as me?" Ethan didn't hesitate. His fist connected with Ryan's jaw, the force of the punch sending him crashing to the floor. Ryan groaned, attempting to push himself up, but before he could recover, the sound of sirens filled the air. Ethan exhaled sharply, stepping back just as two uniformed officers stormed into the room, guns drawn. "Ryan Parker," one of them barked. "You're under arrest for trespassing, assault, and violation of a restraining order." Ryan wiped the blood from his mouth, laughing bitterly. "This isn't over." His gaze snapped to Emily, dark and filled with malice. "You think this ends with me in handcuffs? You're a fool if you think I'm the only danger in your life." Emily didn't flinch. She met his glare, steady and unwavering, then whispered the words she had been waiting years to say. "I'm finally free." Ryan's smirk faltered, just for a second. And then, just like that, he was dragged away, his threats fading into the distance. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's knees buckled, the adrenaline draining from her body, but before she could hit the ground, Ethan caught her, holding her as if he'd never let go. His arms wrapped around her, holding her tightly. His heartbeat thundered against her ear as his hands gently stroked her hair. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "He can't hurt you any more." Emily closed her eyes, sinking into his warmth. For the first time in years, she let herself believe it. For the first time in years, she truly believed it. She and her daughters were finally safe. And Ryan Parker was nothing more than a ghost of the past. The morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the Montgomery estate. For the first time in forever, Emily didn't wake up to fear. No uncertainty. No relentless burden of survival. Instead, she awoke to peace. The sound of laughter, her daughter's laughter. It echoed from the hallway, light and sweet, filling the once sterile mansion with something it had long been missing: life. Emily sat up slowly, running a hand through her hair as she let the moment sink in. It still felt surreal. Being here, being safe, being free. The last few days had been a whirlwind. Ryan's arrest, the endless police questioning, the weight of finally letting go of the past. And through it all, Ethan had been there. Steady, unwavering, hers. She exhaled, glancing toward the bedroom door just as it creaked open. Lily and Sophie bounded in first, their small feet pattering across the floor as they climbed onto the bed, giggling. "Mommy, guess what?" Sophie chirped, her eyes bright with excitement. "Ethan made pancakes, and he let us put extra syrup." Emily's heart swelled at their joy, at how effortlessly they had accepted this new life, as if they had always been meant to be here. Before she could respond, Ethan appeared in the doorway, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. He held a tray with 3 plates, each stacked high with golden pancakes. "Breakfast in bed," he announced, stepping inside. "I figured you could use a morning where someone else takes care of you for a change." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You cooked?" she teased, noting the faint trace of flour dusting the sleeve of his shirt. Ethan scoffed, setting the tray down carefully. "Don't sound so surprised. I happen to be an excellent chef." Lily giggled. "He almost burned the first batch." Ethan shot her a mock glare. Traitor. But the playful glint in his eyes remained as he turned back to Emily. His expression softened, and for a moment they just looked at each other. No words, just understanding. Emily felt the weight of everything between them, the pain, the loss, the years of separation that had nearly broken them. But now it no longer felt like a wound, it felt like something healed, something whole. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "Thank you," she said, meaning it in more ways than she could express. Ethan's fingers curled around hers, his grip warm, steady. "You don't have to thank me," he murmured. "You and the girls, you belong here." Emily's breath caught. "You belong here." How long had she dreamed of hearing those words? How long had she convinced herself that belonging was something meant for other people, not for her? She glanced at her daughters, their faces sticky with syrup, their giggles filling the room, and realized she didn't want to run anymore. She wanted this. She wanted him. Ethan must have sensed her thoughts. His hand slipped into his pocket, and when he pulled it out, she froze. A ring. Not the old silver one she had clung to for years, the one that symbolized a past filled with heartbreak. But something new, something shining. Her breath hitched as he took her hand, his thumb grazing over her knuckles. Ethan traced her knuckles with his thumb. "I don't just want to marry you, Emily. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're safe, that you never have to be afraid again, that Lily and Sophie will never have to wonder if they belong. I want forever with you. I spent years thinking I lost you forever, that I had ruined everything, but you came back into my life and I'm not letting you go again." He exhaled slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Stay. Not just for now, not just because it's safe, but because this is where you belong." Emily's vision blurred with unshed tears. "Ethan," he smiled, that small, knowing smile that had always undone her. His voice was quiet, intimate, meant only for her. "Not because we have history, not because of the past, but because I love you, and I love them." He glanced at Lily and Sophie, who were now watching with wide eyes, their tiny hands gripping each other's in anticipation. "I want forever with you, Emily. Say yes. I want to be their father. I want to be your husband. I want us to be a family, for real this time." Emily felt something inside her break, the last of her doubts, her fears, the part of her that had spent years believing she wasn't worthy of this kind of love. She looked at her daughters, their innocent, hopeful faces, and then at Ethan, the man who had fought for her, who had chosen her, who had never truly stopped loving her. And suddenly the answer was easy. She nodded, her breath catching as a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Yeah." The relief on Ethan's face was immediate. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking slightly as if he couldn't believe this was real. Then, without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Lily and Sophie squealed, throwing themselves into the embrace, giggling, laughing. Their family was finally complete. For the first time in her life, Emily wasn't afraid of the future. For the first time, she had a new beginning. What a powerful story. Here at Unwritten Lives, every video is created with great care to touch your heart and bring meaningful reflections on life. We'd love to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We truly enjoy reading your messages. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this take days to create, and your support encourages us to keep bringing you inspiring and heartfelt content. Thank you for being part of our community. See you in the next video.